Well, you're about to see exactly why Trump picked Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, because the way he shut down Margaret Brennan from CBS over Trump's tariffs plans was almost like he took her back to basic economics class one more time. Just watch this incredible exchange before I tell you what's really going on.
But I want to ask you about tariffs, because you were just in Canada this past week. China is Canada's second biggest export market, Mexico's third. In this ongoing trade back and forth the U.S. is having, isn't there a risk that China will ultimately be the winner? If it's too costly to deal with the United States, won't they benefit?
Well, actually, China and Canada are involved in a mini trade war right now. In fact, the Chinese have imposed a bunch of tariffs, reciprocal or retaliatory tariffs on Canada after Canada imposed tariffs on them. So here's the way everyone needs to understand this, okay? The president rightfully believes that the balance of global trade is completely off kilter. For 30 or 40 years, we have allowed countries to treat us unfairly in global trade, much of it during the Cold War because we wanted them to be rich and prosperous because they were our allies in the Cold War. But now that has to change. You look at the European Union. The European Union's economy is about the same size as ours. It's not a low-wage economy. It's very comparable to ours in terms of its composition and so forth. Why do they have a trade surplus with us? So what the president is saying is two things. Number one, there are critical industries like aluminum, like steel, like semiconductors, like automobile manufacturing that he rightfully believes, President Trump rightfully believes the U.S. needs to have a domestic capability. And the way you protect those industries and build that capability is by ensuring that there's economic incentives to produce in the United States. The second is global, and that is we are going to put tariffs on countries reciprocal to what they impose on us. And so this is a global. It's not against Canada. It's not against Mexico. It's not against the EU. It's everybody.
What kind of paradox is it that it's now the left that's more concerned about China's predatory trade policies? Listen, for Canada, there's no comparison for trade between a next-door neighbor like the US versus a communist regime on the other side of the planet. And they'd rather just work to correct the nearly $64 billion of annual trade deficit with the United States over completely overhauling their trade infrastructure for China, especially when the new Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has said Canada does not share Chinese values on trade. While even China's warned Canada to not use them as a temporary bargaining chip against the US in trade. By the way, we're having some of the most important conversations of our time here, so please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to become a part of the conversation. And what is even more satisfying is how a Democrat party with less than 30% approval rating was trying hard before the inauguration to create some sort of thaw between Marco Rubio and Donald Trump, and then even Elon Musk, with hit pieces like this against Rubio by the likes of Politico claiming he'd be out of the administration soon. They couldn't have been more proven wrong. And watch how Marco Rubio speaks the hard truth about the decline of America's manufacturing sector, because a lot of these trade and labor troubles are downstream from that.
And then from that new baseline of fairness and reciprocity, we will engage, potentially, in bilateral negotiations with countries around the world on new trade arrangements that make sense for both sides. Fairness. But right now, it's not fair. We're going to reset the baseline, and then we can enter into these bilateral agreements, potentially, with countries so that our trade is fair. What's not going to continue is, of course, these countries
So this is all
upset.
just about leverage to get bilateral, not North American free
leverage.
Trade deals, renegotiation?
No, it's not leverage, it's fairness. It's resetting baseline fairness. And then from there, we can work on deals and so forth, because they'll have products we don't make, we have products they don't make. That's where trade works the best. It has to be free, but it has to be fair. And right now, it's only free on one side, and it's not fair for the other side.
Well, you know,
it's an
sir,
unsustainable position.
The ad hoc nature of these policy announcements and pullbacks are causing concern in the marketplace, as we saw this past week. So I heard you describe what seemed like a strategy to get to negotiations on a bilateral front. You also seem to negotiate, you say this was national security minded, but then we also see comments by the president of like 200% tariffs on champagne. That's not a critical industry for the United States. That seems more emotional.
No, that's called retaliation. That's what happens in these trade exchanges. They're going to increase tariffs on. They already have high tariffs. They're going to add more to their tariffs. Fine. Then we'll have to find something to. I mean, you tell me. I mean, Canada's going after whiskey and orange juice and
in retaliation.
Yeah, exactly. So that sounds pretty petty to me as well. So what's the difference? The point is, I get it. I understand why these countries don't like it, because the status quo of trade is good for them. It benefits them. They like the status quo. We don't like the status quo. We are going to set a new status quo, and then we can negotiate something, if they want to, that is fair for both sides.
Not just that. You can't just pluck these tariffs against China or Canada and look at them in isolation. Two of America's largest vulnerabilities when it comes to the Chinese is a tiny island of Taiwan that manufactures the bulk of global semiconductor supply. And when the critical trading passageway in South America with the Panama Canal, tariffs are Donald Trump's way of twisting your opponent's arm over their issues, which is exactly what was threatening to Ukraine and Russia if they didn't sit across at the negotiating table. So let's learn to zoom out a bit, because it's really curious that the modern Democratic Party is suddenly pretending to be outraged over the unfair trade practices with foreign nations when the domestic American worker has been getting undercut in the global labor market for decades.
We have deindustrialized this country. Okay, deindustrialize the United States of America. There are things we can no longer make, and we have to be able to make in order to be safe as a country and in order to have jobs. That's why we had a Rust Belt. That's why we've suffered all these important jobs that once sustained entire communities wiped out by trade that basically sent these factories, these jobs, this industrial capability to other places. That cannot and will not continue. President Trump, this is no mystery. He's been talking about this since the 1980s, actually, even before he was a political figure. This is going to happen, and it's going to happen now.
And it's actually worse, because it's not just the American worker being undercut in the world economy, especially in North America, with agreements like NAFTA, but it's the double hit with the free rein given to foreign nations to dump their cheaply made goods to the U.S. economy. That's what happened to the car manufacturing industry in the US, with a bulk of auto manufacturing moving to a cheaper place like Mexico, with the US not getting either the benefit of the employment opportunity nor the economic incentive for more investment in the auto sector. What we're seeing right now with China and Mexico is really similar to what we saw in the 80s with Japan as a giant of electronics manufacturing, and it's surprising when you look at this clip of Donald Trump from nearly 40 years ago, speaking the exact same way about unfair trade as he does right now.
You took out a full-page ad in major U.S. newspapers last year criticizing U.S. foreign policy. What would you do differently, Donald?
I'd make our allies, forgetting about the enemies you can't talk to so easily, I'd make our allies pay their fair share. We're a debtor nation. Something's going to happen over the next number of years with this country, because you can't keep going on losing $200 billion, and yet we let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible. They don't have laws against it. They just make it impossible. They come over here, they sell their cars, their VCRs, they knock the hell out of our companies. And, hey, I have tremendous respect for the Japanese people. I mean, you can respect somebody that's beating the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country. Kuwait, they live like kings. The poorest person in Kuwait, they live like kings. And yet they're not paying. We make it possible for them to sell their oil. Why aren't they paying us 25% of what they're making? It's a joke.
Truly a revelation, isn't it? And to add to this, the fact that the past 40 years of globalization has only made the problem worse, with nations with cheap and unregulated labor markets taking advantage of the richest consumer market in the world and building entire manufacturing industries while doing so. And perhaps it's about time the US finally removed that crutch, but tell me in the comments how you process this, and please share this with people that have an important voice to add, because I think it's going to be at least a couple of years before we see the full impact of this reversal of decades of the US trade policy.